Hi, it's Lee, and today I'm colouring Emma's Tail by Grazia Salvo. And I wanted a smaller picture to colour, and I decided on this one. My real purpose, though, is to try and solve a problem I have with the Derwent Chromaflow pencils. My problem is that there are just not enough reds, browns, and greys in the set to satisfy my wants. I know comparison is the thief of joy, but I can't help comparing the set to my Prismacolors that have a large array of reds, browns, and greys, and everything else in between in the 150 set. And I'm not the only one to compare the Prismacolors either. Derwent themselves do it as well on their website. And that got me thinking, both are wax-based, so really, they should work well together. So let's find out. And let's have a colour palette of reds, browns and greys so we can see if we can enhance this set of Chromaflows with a couple of Prismacolors. By the way, I know I haven't put up many colouring videos lately. Few reasons for that. Most people know that I have a shoulder injury that is sadly not getting any better. And of course, being the clumsy klutz that I am, last week I celebrated my birthday by falling down the stairs. So I'm a bit black and blue, and of course, the shoulder injury got hurt again in that tumble, as well as what I'm calling my good shoulder. So I've had to nurse that for a week or so. The whole thing, as well as picking up an infection, has put me a little bit out of sorts because it's just so hard to sleep with these injuries. And even though coffee usually works, it's not working at the moment. And coffee and a bit of chocolate might do the trick. Who knows? Speaking of chocolate and the way my mind goes, we've just had Easter, and many people celebrate with chocolate Easter eggs. Not me. I don't like chocolate Easter eggs. I like my chocolate solid in a bar. I figure I get more chocolate that way. But chocolate eggs aren't the only eggs that people love. Some people love the ones that are far more expensive. Back in 1842, Gustave Fabergé opened a jewelry store in St. Petersburg, and he named it after himself, and he gave it a bit of oomph as the House of Fabergé. By the way, his real name wasn't Fabergé. That's actually it was something like Faubourg, and he added the E and then put on the accent above the E. But anyway, he had a good business there. He worked just making simple pieces of jewelry, like agate necklaces and bracelets, nothing fancy, just, the stock standards of the day. But I guess business must have been good because Gustav ended up retiring in 1860. Now, he didn't close up or sell the business. He merely left it in the capable hands of two other jewelers trading under his name. Now, by this time, Gustav and his wife had three children, and the eldest, Peter Carl Fabergé, he would become a household name. Most people know him as Carl Fabergé, or Charles, and most people know of the thing he's most famous for, the Fabergé eggs. Carl not only had a father that was a jeweler with his own store, but he was blessed with a great education. He was educated in Dresden. He was sent to England to learn English. His trips around Europe included receiving tuition from respected goldsmiths. There was college in Paris, and there was the opportunity, which he took, to visit and study galleries and museums housing beautiful jewelry collections. And Carl was truly set up before he took his apprenticeship with a master jeweler in Germany. And all of this was achieved before he even had turned 18. By 1864, he returned to St. Petersburg and to the House of Fabergé, and he continued being tutored by those existing jewelers running the business. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly didn't have my act together at that age. Not sure I have it together now, to be honest. Reading between the lines, when you look at Carl, you realize that he knew the value of networking to a business. And I mean, he did do one business course at a trade school, so maybe that rubbed off. He was already quite young when he made friends with the directors of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And what he did was some unpaid voluntary work there. The Hermitage Museum is a place I've had on my bucket list for so long. It's part of 6 historical buildings, which include the Winter Palace, which is just stunning. The Hermitage Museum was founded by Catherine the Great and is said to have the largest collection of paintings in the world. Now, I'm not sure what Karl did in this period as far as jewellery goes, but when he took over his father's firm aged 26 in 1872, he was already married and he was well known for his repair and restoration work at the museum. And so much so, he restored all these items from the Black Sea, and the museum was so impressed with his work that he was able to exhibit these restored artifacts at the Pan-Russian Exhibition of Industry and Arts in Moscow, and it was there that he was awarded his first gold medal. But that would be he would be just one of many jewelers there. He was a small fish in a big pond, and at least 5 of those were imperial jewelers, meaning they supplied jewelry to the Tsar and Tsarina, the Russian royal family. The exhibition, though, did elevate his position, and now the Tsar and Tsarina knew who he was. His work there really impressed them and Tsar Alexander III because it showed off the proud Russian history and the people of Russia. And the royals even stopped by the house of Fabergé and, had a look around and purchased some cufflinks. So now that he was the owner of the House of Fabergé, it was clear that he wanted to be the new broom and sweep in and make changes to the jewellery line. No more modest jewellery, he was about to make a splash. And it wasn't a splash from a monetary point of view he wanted. He wanted to make something that showed craftsmanship and art. And he also knew that as well as networking, what he needed was marketing. And the best way to get yourself known was to become associated with royalty, the Tsar and Tsarina. By this time, the House of Fabergé had about 20 employees, but it was about to get a whole lot bigger. By 1855, he was awarded the Imperial Warrant, which basically means that he was a supplier to the royal court. When you see that coat of arms on things, especially if you live in the UK, you see it everywhere. So a couple of years after this, the Tsar Alexander III, his brother actually approached Fabergé as sort of an intermediary on behalf of the Tsar to create an Easter gift for his wife. Now, Fabergé, knowing that the Tsarina was originally a princess from Denmark, designed a piece that was inspired by an egg in the Royal Danish collection. And he used that egg for inspiration, together with his own imagination, to design the first imperial egg, which is called the hen egg, the very first Fabergé egg. When Easter came about, which is an extremely important holiday in the Russian calendar, Fabergé presented the hen egg to the Tsar. The concept of the egg is very similar to Russian nesting dolls, where each doll contains smaller dolls inside. And the Fabergé egg is always shaped like an egg, and inside the yolk there is another surprise. Now, the egg was a hit with the Tsarina. She loved the nod to her Danish heritage, as well as the beautiful design, white enamel on the outside shell, and when you opened up the shell, there was the gold yolk of the egg. Then, opening up the yolk, there was a gold hen with rubies for eyes. Opening up the hen, inside was a gold and diamond miniature replica of the crown and a tiny ruby pendant. And it's actually said that Fabergé sort of revived enameling and revived that craft work with that initial first egg, the hen egg. And he was inspired by Japanese art to do this, which I haven't got any records that he actually visited Japan. So I guess from other museums this inspiration came. Fabergé, as the business owner, obviously gets the credit for this beautiful egg, but it wasn't actually made by him. It was made by one of his workers. And it worked its magic, though. the Tsar immediately knew how to keep his wife happy, and he commissioned a standing order with Fabergé to create an egg each year for Easter. Now, there were some conditions. Each egg had to be unique, and it always had to contain a surprise. Could be a piece of jewelry, a little clock, a tiny portrait, and the shells over the years became even more elaborate on these gorgeous eggs. Now, the Tsar didn't specify what he wanted. He didn't dictate the design. Fabergé was pretty well given free rein, although they sometimes did have a little bit of discussion or collaboration on the egg. Each year, an egg would be created that was intricate and beautiful. It had gemstones and beautiful surprises inside. And all the eggs were just so different that you could find a little ship inside, fold out miniatures. They're all just beautifully decorated, enamel, jewels, gold, intricacy, and this craftsmanship with skill and so much detail would take over a year to create just one egg. But by 1894, Tsar Alexander III had passed away and his son Nicholas II took over. Now, no eggs were created in 1904 and 5 due to the Russo-Japanese War and the bloody Sunday Massacre, which was an unsuccessful revolution. Nicholas II, though, he did keep up the tradition of an annual Fabergé egg to gift his wife, and he also added another egg to gift to his mother, the now dowager. So the tradition doubled, and each year 2 imperial Fabergé eggs would be presented. Now, only the eggs gifted to the royals are known as imperial Fabergé eggs. Now, Fabergé's business was flourishing during this time, and he was the largest jewelry business in the country. There was the original St. Petersburg branch, there was Moscow, there was London and Kiev, and there was about 500 people producing more than 150,000 pieces of jewelry. And the bread and butter for Fabergé was not the Fabergé eggs, even though the amount that they cost was ridiculous compared to the amount of income the average person earned in Russia. But he was selling things like parasol handles, a cigarette and card cases, clocks, animals and flower decorations, toiletry sets, all sorts of things. So he was recognized as a supreme jeweler, not only in Russia, but Paris, and he was receiving medals and all amount of honors, being asked to judge at events. But then, of course, World War One happened, and the House of Fabergé, instead of being a high-class jeweler with beautiful craftsmanship and art, began processing military orders. By 1917, everything else would change forever. The October Revolution would happen, and the Bolsheviks would take over and nationalize Fabergé's business. Fabergé managed to escape. Funnily enough, he asked for 10 minutes to collect his things, and he did the famous slip out the back door and managed to take some clothes, wine, and fled to Switzerland, where he passed away actually a few years after. One of his sons, though, that worked at the House of Fabergé at the time, he remained in Russia until 1927. And by this stage, Fabergé had about 1,500 employees. Now, the Dowager and her family, they were also able to escape as well. They got on a battleship that was organised by George V. There was some family relationship there, and so he sent a British battleship to collect her and her family, not Nicholas II, who was the current Tsar. Now, when she left, she'd been gifted 20 imperial Fabergé eggs, but it seems that she took only one with her. The last egg that had been gifted to her by her son, Tsar Nicholas II, the Order of St. George egg. Now, this was created in 1916, and it was after the Great War, and materials were rare. At that time, everything had been used in the war effort, and this one was actually one of Fabergé's two last completed eggs. It's silver, and it's got a white enamel on it with no other embellishments. It's actually quite plain compared to some of his others, but it's still stunningly beautiful. It's set with miniature portraits of Nicholas II and of his son Alexei, concealed beneath the badge of the Order of St. George with a silver medal of the order. And this award was given for bravery on the front. So she didn't leave empty-handed. She left with that egg that obviously reminded her of the Tsar and her grandchild, and about 20 million pounds of jewels and other treasures on the trip, including some Rembrandts rolled up. So, but this is the only egg that's known to have left the country with its owner. Now, the Dowager ended up living in London and Sandringham, and she eventually ended up returning to her native Denmark. Her son, Tsar Nicholas II, and his wife Alexandra and their children didn't escape the revolution, and they were captured. That didn't end well. But what about the eggs? At the time, between the gifts to the now Dowager and the Tsarina, there were 50 imperial eggs and 2 eggs that were works in progress. The Dowager would have had 30 eggs, and the Tsarina would have had 20. And Fabergé in their workshop would have had those other 2 that were works in progress. One was later found, by the way, and it was very much a work in progress. Now, did the Tsarina take more eggs with her? Now, this seems to be really doubtful, and it seems to be pretty well accepted that she only took the Order of the St. George egg. Now, Fabergé did make other eggs as well. So wealthy people like the Rothschilds, for example, but they were never as elaborate as the imperial eggs made for the Tsar and Tsarina. And there were only 15 of those as opposed to the 50 imperial eggs and 2 works in progress. And they were usually made for really wealthy private collectors, and so presumably kept safe and cozy in their mansions and not in Russia. A lot of his work was commissioned from aristocratic families, especially when he opened his London shop. And so there might be requests from the British royal family and other wealthy English society of the day. And there were even smaller eggs made for other wealthy customers, and even like a, a cheaper version, like a little chain with a necklace and an egg. So all of those things are not imperial eggs. Only the eggs gifted to the Tsar, the Tsarina, and the Dowager are considered imperial eggs, the ones given to members of the royal court. Now, the Bolsheviks, of course, ransacked royal palaces, and many Fabergé eggs were packed off to the Kremlin armory, but not all of them. Some just disappeared. And during times of war and revolution, treasures like imperial eggs, they could be smuggled out of the country, they could be stolen, they could be lost, they could be damaged, or even melted down and destroyed. And another issue is that it was 1917, and although photography had been well used since the 1840s in Russia, many of those photographs showing the imperial eggs would have been destroyed. Sketches from the House of Fabergé would no doubt have been destroyed or removed when the firm was nationalised, and so it'd be really difficult to not only track down the imperial eggs, but also know the intricacies and the detail of each eggs. And it was actually decades until the Kremlin archives were opened in the 1990s when people were able to research those eggs properly. But what happened to these missing eggs? It seems many of the eggs were confiscated by the government at the time and later sold on. Some were found and identified by Fabergé experts, and some seem to have been lost forever. One of the problems with the Fabergé eggs is that it's more than one piece. It's a stand, the egg, and the surprise inside. And the chance of finding something with all three things without damage is already difficult. And the chance of knowing what it is, for example, you find the yolk or the surprise, but not the outer part, the shell, it would be really difficult to know what you're looking at. And considering until recently there was very little research and diagrams or photography on what exactly you were looking for. So luckily there are expert researchers out there that scour auction catalogs. They look at photos. They try to find as much info as they can from the smallest little hint of a photograph, like looking through a glass case on the side with a bit of cloth calf covering it to try and identify an egg, just so that they can see if they can track down the real deal. And I mean, literally, you could run across one of the missing Imperial Fabergé eggs anywhere. You could even be at a jumble sale. Now, you never know what you'll find at a sale. And speaking of which, 10 years ago, a man went to a jumble sale in the Midwest of the good old US of A. He made his way in life by collecting scrap metal and melting it down and selling it. At this jumble sale, he came across a small, ornately decorative piece. Now, he didn't care if it was pretty or not, just how much money it would bring in if he dismantled it and melted down the metals it was made of, and then sold that. The clock inside of it, that was appealing as well. It might bring in a bit more bucks. So he took a risk. He spent $14,000 on this object, and after doing the sums, he realized he could make about a $500 profit on the purchase once it was all melted down and, selling that little clock individually. And this was way more than he would usually spend on these purchases, but he was pretty sure the amount of gold in it would make him the money he calculated. But things didn't go well for him. He seemed to have made a mistake with the calculations or the price of gold, I don't know. But it turns out that he wouldn't be able to get the money back once it was melted down. And it was frustrating, and it gnawed at him that he'd spent so much on this item, more than he would normally, and it wasn't going to give him the $500 he wanted. Playing with this object one day, he decided to look at the clock more closely inside, and it had a name on it, Vacheron Constantin. And so, doing what we all do when we want to know more info, he headed over to Google and described the shape of the object, egg, and the brand on the clock name, Vacheron Constantin, and hit search. Well, I guess he was feeling lucky, because the search results returned an article from a few years earlier in one of the British newspapers. And it was an article based on information from a well-known jeweller in London called Wartsky. Now, they're kind of a big deal, and they have the royal warrant. Reading through this article, the scrap metal dealer had only one thought in mind. He needed to talk to the manager, the expert at Wartsky. He was anxious, he was stressed, and he couldn't eat or sleep. There was only one thing he wanted to do, and that was get to London. There was no time to call and arrange an appointment. It was just time for action. And so he jumped on the first plane to the good old UK and rocked up to Wartsky in his jeans and flannel shirt. And it's a fancy place, so I bet he caught their attention. And he could barely get the words out to ask for the in-house expert, but they eventually came. He showed the manager some photographs of the piece of scrap metal he'd bought at the jumble sale. And the expert, he had the same reaction as the scrap metal dealer. He needed to get over to the USA and see if this piece of scrap metal was what he thought it was. And he was there straight away, entering the kitchen of the scrap metal dealer's house. There was this object that to the expert was beautiful. To the owner of the house, it was scrap metal. And funnily enough, it had been presented sitting next to a chocolate cupcake. I don't know why. It wasn't long before Kieran McCarthy, which is Wardski's expert in all things Fabergé, was holding one of the missing eggs in his hand, named the Third Imperial. Very boring name, really. There was no doubt about its authenticity. The line paws with the attention to detail, even to the underside of the paw, the beautiful craftsmanship of each rib perfectly spaced on the outer egg. The man who thought of the object as scrap metal, not art, had in his possession the Third Imperial Fabergé egg. And according to Kieran McCarthy, he dropped to the floor, but he was still conscious when he told him what he had on his kitchen counter. Now, it's clear that the third egg, literally, the third egg, that's what it's called, made it out of Russia, as it was listed for sale in 1922 by the Soviets when they were raising money for a campaign called Treasures into Tractors. Now, it's not known who it was sold to at the time, but it then resurfaced in an auction catalogue in 1964. And some were bought by his mate, US oil magnate Armand Hammer. But anyway, Wardski's arranged for this article to be published in the British newspaper, seeking information to find the missing eggs, including this third egg, which had thought to be lost. And it was that article that the scrap metal dealer came across on his Google search. And over time, many of those imperial eggs that left Russia, about 14 or so, were sold to Armand Hammer, a mate of Joseph Stalin's. And he was also a big president of oil and gas company, a personal friend of Lenin as well. So lots of names there as well. So lots of names there. Now, the value of the egg, can you imagine this scrap metal dealer sitting there after what he's been told and what his Googling has told him, thinking, I'm not going to make $500 on this egg at all. Now, can you imagine his face when he thought that he'd be making $500 on this egg, and then, it turned out not to be the $500. And then he gets the shock news that its value was estimated to be $33 million. Now, that was 14 grand well spent and a plane fare to the UK, I would think. Pretty good ROI on that one. Now, Warski's actually purchased the third imperial egg, and they sold it to an unnamed private collector. The seller remained anonymous, the guy that had purchased it for 14 grand, but no doubt he has a new appreciation of art now. And it's unclear how much money he actually received from the sale of the 33rd egg, whether it was 33 million or a lesser amount. But can you imagine how the seller at the jumble sale would have felt? He sold something for 14,000. He probably thought it was a great deal, and it turns out to be worth 33 million. I mean, you wouldn't read about it, but I actually know a story of this that was local to me. A small table was put into the auction rooms around uh, the corner from my house, and a friend that was an antique dealer purchased it. And he paid like $3,000 for it, which was really quite expensive for that auction house, because he felt that it had something to it. Anyway, that table got auctioned at Sotheby's or Christie's, one of them, and it turned out to be worth $500,000. So that was a deal. So it does happen, and Antiques Roadshow, often people bring in things that have been sitting on the mantelpiece and they turn out to be these things that are extremely valuable that you might think are ugly or scrap metal or you don't consider them at all. Now, Kieran McCarthy, Wartsky's expert, he actually told the world about the lost Imperial Fabergé Easter egg, and they actually exhibited it for the first time in 112 years. And he's an expert on Fabergé. You can see on his website many other books and studies that he's done on Fabergé, that hugely successful brand. And he's got a real career boost as well. He was appointed as curator of a successful exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London that went right up to 2022, coinciding with Queen Elizabeth II's Platinum Jubilee. Now, of the 52 imperial eggs, including those two works in progress, the whereabouts of 43 of them are known, but 8 are missing. So, have I counted correctly? 5 of them are meant to have been destroyed, or they're believed to have been as destroyed. But the other 3 have escaped Russia. And I think I said 8 because those 2 eggs work in progress. One was actually found, and it was a very half done blue egg, beautiful blue, on a, like a white cloud. But it clearly was in the very beginning stages, and the other egg that was a work in progress, I don't know that it even got to the practical stages yet. I think it might have just been in the sketch stage. I'm really not sure, how much information they have on that second egg. But one egg ended up with the late Princess Grace of Monaco, and 3 with the late Queen Elizabeth II. Malcolm Forbes, that you would know the name from Forbes magazine, he was an avid collector of Fabergé eggs. And I read somewhere that he liked that there was a set number of the eggs to collect. So it seemed like an achievable way to get in a collection. And he not only collected the imperial eggs, but also those 15 eggs that had been made for the wealthy. And he ended up with 9 eggs. And in 2004, the oil and gas tycoon Victor Vekselberg paid about £68 million for those 9 eggs from the Forbes collection. And he actually put them in a museum in Russia for everyone to enjoy. 10 eggs are also believed to be in the Kremlin armory, and they would never have left the country. And then there's still the missing eggs. One's a cherub with a chariot on it, and there's a very old photograph of it from an exhibition, and you can see in the reflection the wheel of the chariot. There's also missing the 5th egg that was made, the necessary egg, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. It was actually featured at a London exhibition, and funnily enough, Warski's was the jeweler that last sold the egg back in 1952, but the buyer is listed in their records as a stranger. So no way to identify who that is, but he actually paid £1,250 for it back in 1952, which is quite a lot of money. Now, 5 of those eggs, there's just no trace of them coming to the West. The possible it could be found, but maybe they were destroyed. And there's a lot of speculation about them. 2 of those eggs, um, that the speculation really revolves around is the commemorative egg and the Royal Danish egg. Now, many people believe that the Royal Danish egg, which was presented to the Dowager when she was in her home at Copenhagen, it may still be there in Denmark. Now, no official word on that, but maybe Queen Mary is using it as paperweight. But these eggs were just amazing, and if you have a chance, have a look at some of them. Often you can't see the surprise, and some of the surprises have been recovered, but not the outer shells, so it's all a bit of a uh, a problem when you've got such beautiful things and there's just, so many diamonds and gems and all sorts on these eggs. And then the fact that they're nesting and there's things inside and things inside. So you might have the outer shell, but you might not have the other ones. Now, the St. George egg, that's believed to have been sold by the Dowager's younger son. And some people still believe that the Dowager might have taken other eggs with her that haven't been destroyed. I mean, who knows? They may well be out there somewhere. There may also be other imperial eggs as well. Now, these were the seconds, if you like. Often the Tsar would give away prototypes or replicas that didn't have as many details, or, for example, like the seconds, that's what I call them. They didn't open, or the jewels were of lesser quality. Now, there might be a few of those floating around, mostly in private collections. And that necessaire egg and the cherub with the chariot, they really believe that they will be able to recover them because the cherub and chariot was in America in 1934 and 1941. And they've been able to trace it to there. So maybe someone in America, check your attic. It looks absolutely gorgeous. And as I said, Watsky sold the necessaire egg in London in 1952. So um, they definitely know it's around. But, you know, Fabergé has had such an amazing history, and it's not over. In 1924, the sons of Carl Fabergé, Alexander and Eugene, they decided to carry on the family legacy, and they opened a new firm called Fabergé and C, crafting exquisite jewelry and stamping their creations with the mark Fabergé Paris. Fast forward to 1951, and they moved into the world of fragrance. An enterprising fellow named Samuel Rubin bought the rights to the Fabergé name for perfumes. He later sold that brand in 1964 to Rayette, a company that rebranded itself as Rayette and Fabergé. From there, things things just took off a bit more, and the Fabergé name exploded, and they went into clothing, hair products, colognes like Brut, which became a bestseller, a perfume called Babe, and there was even some dabbling in film production, and jewelry, of course, eventually made its comeback into the product lineup. But alongside it came knockoffs and wannabes, so-called Faubourg pieces and Fabergé-style trinkets that were flooding the market. So, what you have might not be a real Fabergé. And Joan Collins was well known for giving those sort of Faubourg trinkets a bit of an airing. And by 1989, Unilever stepped into the picture and they bought Fabergé Inc. and Elizabeth Arden for about $1.5 billion, um, putting them right up there in the cosmetics branding game. And they renamed the company Alida Fabergé, and they spread the brand far and wide, sort of licensing everything they could from jewelry to eyeglasses with the Fabergé brand. Now, in that same year, German jeweler Victor Mayer snagged exclusive rights to produce authentic Fabergé eggs, jewelry, and watches made with precious metals, gems, or enamel and diamonds. So, really going with that theme that Carl Fabergé had originally created. And they presented new collections of Fabergé collections to Russian royalty in 1991. And that partnership lasted until 2009 for the jewelry and 2012 for the watches. And meanwhile, there's other licensed products under the Fabergé name, perfumes, dolls, um, and with that Fabergé Paris, London, New York brand on it. And today, the Fabergé name is back where it belongs, gracing only fine jewelry and gemstones, and it's under the name of Fabergé Limited. So it lives on with its history and luxury, sort of gone complete circle back to where it started. and it's loved by royalty, celebrities, billionaires. They all collect Fabergé pieces. Joan Rivers' estate had $2.2 million worth of Fabergé items when it was sold at auction. But the ones that hold the most of the Fabergé imperial eggs are the Kremlin Armoury, the British Royal Collection, and there's a couple of smaller museums in the US mainly that have some eggs, but there's a lot that have other things that Fabergé created. Remember, I said in those workshops, so we're producing 150,000 pieces a year. So there's small animal sculptures, floral studies, functional items like cigarette cases, card cases, that sort of thing, and jewelry. And a lot of those are in smaller museums, particularly in the US, and the rest is owned by private collectors. And the Imperial Egg is featured obviously in documentaries, in books, in films. There's references to it in the James Bond movie Octopussy, Ocean's 12, even in the Simpsons episode Round Springfield, um, where a character spent all his money on a habit of buying Fabergé eggs. And of course, you really know you've made it when the makers of Barbie get a license. So remember, Fabergé took commissions from a few wealthy clients like the Rothschild family. So your grandma may have received a Fabergé egg, even if it wasn't an imperial egg, or maybe even a prototype. So, have a look around in the attic this weekend. And just to give you an idea, the Tessenary egg, which was made in 1913 to mark 300 years of Romanov rule, it featured gold, and silver, and diamonds, and had turquoise and ivory on it. Now, that actually cost 21,300 rubles at the time in 1913. And at the time, the average Russian wage was $500, 500 rubles a year. So the cost of these imperial eggs was enormous. And as we can see from what the third imperial egg sold for, they've only increased and increased. So I just want to say, going back to this book, that the paper is quite toothy, and both pencils were loving it. I found that the use of the Prismacolors seemed to smooth out the Derwents far more than using them on their own for me. And of course, we all have different colouring styles and pressures, and what my experience may be might be different from yours, but to me, adding the Prismacolors made it far easier to not only get the colours I wanted and the vibrancy, but without the pesky Prismacolor dust and over waxiness. And I think it's a match made in heaven, but I'd love to know what you think. And by the way, I think we can learn a lot from the recovery of the third egg. Sometimes we just can't see things from a different perspective. One person may see a pile of scrap metal, and the other sees a beautiful piece of art. And just like when we're colouring, we're often our harshest critics, and what might be your hot mess might be someone else's inspiration and aspiration. Anyway, that's it from me. Until next time, stay safe and happy colouring.